afternoon. Dr. Kimi, we are continuing with your evidence. You were, I think, the current slide. You hadn't started with that slide.
No.
All right. So, yeah, you may proceed.
Okay. All right. So maybe just as a reminder, we're dealing with this particular table, which is that global evidence of uneven racial outcome with respect to fraud, waste, and abuse. And I'm saying that there are a couple of caveats and questions that we need to ask about this sort of result. First, I think it's important to clarify what is actually meant when we say that there is a racial bias. Then we have to ask whether the results that you've seen are not in fact evidence of racial bias, but are an artifact of the classification scheme that are used. So if there were slight changes to the classification scheme, or even significant changes to the classification scheme, would that result that you saw disappear? So is it just an artifact, something that pops out just because of what we've done and is in fact not really there? So it's a constructed result. And then the third question is, how reproducible or verifiable is this result? So I'm going to deal with each of those questions in turn. When I say that we have evidence of a racial bias, I mean, in the first instance, that the bias is meaningful with respect to the racial assignment scheme. And I'm using meaningful there as it's a real effect and it's measurable. But it is with respect to the racial assignment scheme that we have implemented. So the result is about black versus not black, where black has that specific meaning that we've assigned to it based on those list of names. The second part of it means that we have found, as I think we discussed a little bit before lunch, that the racial bias represents a correlation between that classifier and FWA status. And we're not making any claims here with this set of data about a causal link or mechanism. We're simply saying that that relationship exists. And as we said, it may be that there's some other factors that explain it, but that those factors have to be produced. The assumption would be, upon seeing the result, that there is an effect that has to be explained. And we can infer that this bias in some way underestimates the true level of bias with respect to, if we can think of it, true racial classification. So if you had a gold standard where everyone self-classified, we would say that because of the way that we've constructed the race variable, we would underestimate the true effect of the racial bias. And that we can then infer, once we found a meaningful result with respect to this classification, that in the real world it would be at least this and potentially more. So this is a sort of baseline level of deviance in that table. Then we can ask the question, as I said, is this just an artifact? We can answer it in two ways. Remember that we had a clean racial classifier. That set of names that we harvested from existing sources. And it's clean in the sense that that classification has never opened the PCNS data file. So it looks only at the list of names and then says, make the assignment based on this list of names. So it's a far more restrictive set. And under that scheme, only about 16% of providers are classified black. If we use that scheme, we find a risk ratio, and now I'm going to quote those three figures, we don't need the table anymore. The risk ratio of 1.38, the p-value of 2 to the power e to the minus 83, and a population risk of 25%. So we would then conclude that there is a very marginal difference between this table and the one that we used with our broader racial classification. So if we use the restricted version, that we would still find a deviation of about 40%, and that it would have similar impossibility that it would have occurred by chance. And so it would be meaningful in the same way. I won't repeat this exercise for subsequent tables, but I have done them for every table. I have rerun the table with a more restricted version and verified that the result is still meaningful by the measures that we have set. Right? There's a measurable deviation. The probability is extremely low, and the population risk is meaningful. Those three factors, they repeat if we use what we can think of as race 1, a restricted version. So
Can you explain the restricted version?
Okay.
Define the restricted racial classification.
So the restricted racial classification says we never look at the names in our data set at all. Right? The names in that PCNS data set, they may as well be written in Cyrillic. We only look at names that we can, of external sources, classify black or white or not black, and we apply that classification to the data set. So we never look at a name, we never look at Smith and say, Smith, you are white, and Vezi, you are black. We never look at that. We just look at a list of names and we make an independent assessment. Smith is white, Vezi is black, etc. Then you use that racial classification. So it's far more restrictive because we don't have that huge database of names, but the effect size is the same, whether we use that restricted version or our expanded version. Okay. Sorry, I'm now. The second method would be to say, what if we had made errors in our classification scheme? And my best guess is that we have about a 1% misclassification rate from white, from not black to black. So there's only, in any 100 names, only one of those is incorrectly classified as black, when it should in fact be not black. I'm going to assume that we had made a 5% error. And in fact, that we made a 5% error both ways. So contrary to what I would believe the case is, I'm going to take a worst case scenario, a slightly worst case scenario, and say 5% each way. I'm then going to randomly reclassify names, and I'm going to do that 1,000 times, or 10,000 times. And then I'm going to look at the result with that random classification. And what we find is that we end up with a risk ratio of 1.36 and a p-value of 2 to the e to the minus 101. So that means even if we made an error, and a fairly substantial error in our classification, a 5% error, that we still end up with a significant result. And we can do this exercise over and over, of course. Let's say we had a 15%. What that means is, if I printed out a list of black names in that database, 100 black names, you would find 15 names that you would say were not black among them, by consensus. And if I printed out a list of 100 white, black names, you would find 15 black names among them. With that sort of misclassification, which is quite egregious, you know, it would be a sloppy system that produced that sort of result, we still have an average risk ratio of 1.26 and a p-value that is still infinitesimal. So I would conclude from this, in fact, I checked that we'd have to do a 40% misclassification rate, which is basically chance. You'd have to classify black and not black by tossing a slightly lopsided coin. At that level, we can remove the effect. Okay? So we'd have to do something quite odd. So we can conclude from that that the result is robust. It is not due to measurement error with respect to our racial classification. Okay, can the results be reproduced? So I'm going to treat this by analogy. We're going to bake a cake. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that we're going to bake a carrot cake. I may be partial to carrot cake. I'm going to give you the recipe to make a carrot cake. I'm going to tell you what the ingredients are. I'm going to tell you how to put them together. I'm going to tell you how long to bake them, tell you how to mix them. And I expect, when I do it, I get a delicious carrot cake. The cake may not be all that palatable if your taste don't run to carrots, but it's a carrot cake. We could all agree on that. I'm then going to send you away to bake your own carrot cake. You may not follow the recipe precisely. You may decide that you need more salt, that you need less sugar, that you need gluten-free flour, whatever. But you will end up with carrot cake. You will not end up with a cup of soup when you open the oven, right? So the results can be reproduced. You can take them away and do them yourself. You can reclassify the names. You would not, I think, deviate from the classification we have by more than 5%. You can run the same analysis, the detailed step, every step documented. You can make slightly different decisions on the margins. But even with all of those variations, you are not going to account for the scale of deviation that we observed in the outcome. So this is, I would argue, a real and reproducible effect. And as the panel pointed out at the start, in the opening statement, what I will make available is that recipe, the detailed steps to construct the data sets and conduct the analysis, the input files, the ingredients, that classification of black names, and you're then free to apply it to your own data sets and see whether or not, to torture the analogy, you get carrot cake. My bet is that you will. Okay, so now, that being said, now the tables get a little bit more messy, unless there are questions on that. Okay, this is the table by year. So we would construct the data sets in exactly the same way. The universe for the year is all providers were paid during that year. The FWA cases are all cases that were identified as FWA in that year by at least one provider, by at least one of the parties involved. And the various rates are calculated there. So that's enough information to reconstruct the table. But again, as we've decided, we look at three values. We look at the risk rate per year to give us a sense of scale. So the first thing you'll notice is that the risk rate is lower than the 25% that we had in the previous table. And that's because every risk rate is per time period by definition. Risk rate is a time-based effect. What is your risk of contracting something over a time period? So that 25% risk that we saw in the first table at the population level was the risk of being identified as FWA over the 7.5-year period for which we have data. In this table, the risk rate is lower because it's the risk rate per year. And you would expect that you would multiply that somewhere approximating the number of years to get the population risk rate, except, of course, that if you appeared in multiple years, you're only going to count once. So, that's where all of it sort of comes out in the wash.
For 2019, it's just for 6 months of.
Yes, so the 2019 figures are lower because they're for 6 months. What is not a time-based variable is the risk rate. Right? The risk rate is impervious to the time period. That's because by simple algebra, it appears in the numerator and the denominator. So when you divide those two quantities, the time period disappears. So the risk rate is always the risk rate. It doesn't matter whether it's calculated over 10 years or 6 months. And we can see there that the risk rate has increased. It started off quite low, and you'd argue potentially that that 2012 figure, that p-value is low, but it's not, you know.
Talking about the ratio, risk ratio.
Yes, the risk ratio, 1.22 in 2012.
It goes up to almost twice
Yes,
by 2017.
2017, and then it declines quite markedly in 2018, and the data available for 2019 indicate that there is in fact no difference. If we only looked at 2019 data, we'd have a risk ratio of 1.1, which is small, relatively small. We'd have a p-value of 0.04, which means it's not significant. So we would dismiss that as a meaningful result. So in 2019, we'd say nothing's going on. And it's still, even though it's 6 months, it's still a result. But in every year, basically from 2012 through to 2018, we have a deviation in the risk ratio at very significant levels.
You have an understanding of what's happening in 2019 or why this is happening in 2019?
No. Again, I have no input. I mean, yeah, no. I mean, my sense is that perhaps a sort of offhand remarks that having the panel of inquiry has somehow put the brakes on the fraud identification process as a whole. So there's potentially that explanation, but I mean, that would just be speculation.
The same for 2017. You wouldn't know what would
What-
account
what-
for that
Yes.
very increased risk ratio.
Yeah. I would say one more thing here, that last point, it's just a technical point, but just in case someone were wondering, when you do tests of this form, you do a basket of tests. You adjust the p-values to take account of the fact that you do multiple tests. So there are standardized ways of doing that adjustment, and these values have been adjusted to take account of multiple testing. So it's basically when you do multiple testing, it's like taking multiple bites at the cherry, and you're more likely to pick out something just by chance. So we've taken care of the fact that we're doing multiple tests in this table and every table where that sort of thing occurs. Okay. What the conclusion would be from this table would be that the effect that we saw in that global table is not due to an adverse outcome in a single year. It's consistent over time, and in fact the pattern increased as time passed from what would be a relatively low 22% in 2012 up to almost double the risk rate in 2017. Okay. This table is the same data cut by discipline. Right? So in order to read this, again, you would simply read the risk ratio and the p-value, and then as a sanity check, what the population risk rate is. So just for GPs, if we read that, over this 7.5-year period, about a quarter of GPs have been identified as fraud, as FWA cases. That difference between black and not black is now on the order of 13%, and that's a risk ratio of 1.6. Remember that the population risk ratio was 1.4. So this is more extreme than what was found in the population, and again, it is a significant result. The second line there is pharmacies, and what you'd notice about pharmacies almost immediately is that there are 4,500 of them, and 600 pharmacies are classified as black. And this is a result of our classification scheme. Almost 80% of pharmacies did not have the details necessary to classify them, so they were white. So this is a case where that classification, if there had been an effect, has wiped it out. That in fact, black pharmacists are identified at a lower rate than not black pharmacists. 44% compared to 52%. The rate at which pharmacists are identified, though, globally, is very high. Over the 7-year period, more than half of all the pharmacists were identified as FWA. And again, there's a calculation of a risk rate and a p-value. So reading this sort of table gives you a sense of where the deviations are highest by discipline. Social worker, for example, third from the bottom. Those are relatively small numbers, 1,500 people, but the risk ratio is 4.5. 33% of black social workers were identified as FWA cases compared to 7.5% of not black social worker. And so on and so on. So again, this is where it becomes a bit of a rabbit hole. You can carry on doing endless tables of this, but this is a useful indication of the differential rate at which particular disciplines are being identified as FWA, and within that, the different application relative to whether you are black or not black.
You ended with pharmacy, and then
yes.
you were dealing with social worker, but you haven't gone through optometrist and physiotherapist.
Yes. Again, it's simply a matter of saying optometrist, that's 1.4, and that's pretty much what the population risk ratio is. So that's no big deviation from the population finding. There is a sense there that perhaps, I think about a quarter of optometrists were not able to be classified. So in optometrists as well, we have a problem where the misclassification may have obscured any effect that existed. Physiotherapists is also, that's quite a severe
but I mean, that's only the risk ratio. If you look at the absolute numbers on risk, it's still 28.7%
yes.
versus 20.5%.
Yes.
And that still accounts for approximately 7%.
Yeah. So that risk ratio of 1.4 is the same as the population risk ratio. So you'd say even with those caveats, it would appear that the situation among optometrists mirrors that of the population as a whole, with that 40% increase in risk. The physiotherapists has a risk ratio of 2.1, so black physiotherapists are targeted at twice the rate of not black physiotherapists. It's double the risk rate, gives you a risk ratio of 2. And you can see that again in the scale of the figures. Amongst all physiotherapists, about 19% were identified as FWA cases. The differential between black and not black is 32 to 15, double the rate. Dentists, there's a case where there is no deviation. Okay, the risk ratio is 1, so it's what you'd expect if there were no effect of the racial classification at all, and the p-value is 1. It's a completely mean. So we would accept in that case, absent any further information, that the null holds, that there is no racial bias.
Do you have an explanation for that?
No, I mean, at this point, it would need some investigation of what the actual practices were in that specific discipline. And remember, I'm putting up in these tables the list of disciplines that have reasonable counts. So, I mean, if you've looked at the classification scheme for disciplines, it runs to 3 or 4 pages. You know, you can get ambulance, emergency ambulance, etc., etc. So it's, I'm only picking out for this table the large numbers of cases. Independent specialist, again, there seems to be no effect at all. What small effect there are is in fact the converse. The white, non-black specialists are targeted at the
Still
effect is quite small.
46, yes,
Yeah.
46 versus 40.
46 versus 40. But this is a case where you'd say the risk rate is quite small, it's that 16%, and the p-value is really quite high. So you would dismiss this as something that potentially could have occurred simply by chance. You would not necessarily find anything meaningful in that deviation.
So in other words, it could have happened by chance. It's not
Yes.
it's not meaningful.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, if you had to make the conclusion here that amongst independent specialists, there is no evidence within the data of a racial bias. Okay.
You're not leaving the slide, though, are
No,
you?
no.
Okay.
Okay. Again, I would guess that you'd have more detailed information from the testimonies about experience of particular specialists. Psychologist is also an important case. I think after GPs, psychologists are, I think, the second largest group of practitioners in the classification scheme. The deviation there is extreme. It's at 3 1/3, close to 3 1/3. And you can see that 8% amongst white psychologists, 26% amongst black psychologists. That needs, as the saying goes, the more, the higher the level of deviation, the greater the explanation that would be required to justify it.
In other words, here, black psychologists are more than 3 times likely to be
Yes.
investigated.
Yeah. Again, you need to use as your guide there that 2e to the minus 60, which, you know, again is in puzzle putting itself together territory. Just not, this didn't happen by chance. Anesthetist, you know, I'd be taxing my medical knowledge slightly, but anesthetists usually work in as part of a team, some surgeon or other conducting I think it's a more restricted sort of practice. Again, obstetrics, it's a high risk ratio, 1.45. That p-value is now out of the impossible range and now just in the extremely unlikely range. You know, e to the minus 6 is still an extremely small number, but the principle we're going to follow is that if you're going to make a judgment, you need like strong evidence. That would still count, but it would be more of a borderline case. We don't have a cutoff for a p-value. It's always a combination of things. Social workers is the one I mentioned earlier. That's those last 3, in fact, are all instances where they have very high risk ratios, double that of the population. And that means that if you read them as percentages, that stark difference between black and non-black. 33 compared to 7.5 for social workers. 50% of registered counsellors. Those are small numbers. You know, there are only 857 registered counsellors. But of the black registered counsellors, just about half of them have been identified as FWA cases. That's a pretty severe. And there are probably, I would guess, medical explanations or clinical explanations for why some of these population risk rates are so high. Amongst obstetricians, for example, the fact that 50% of obstetricians have been identified as FWA cases. I would assume that there's some clinical explanation for why that has happened rather than... It's just a very high rate, a 1 in 2 chance that you've been identified as FWA in a practice. I mean, that's pretty high, you know. You can flip a coin whether you've, I mean, you know, by a simple probability. Again, there may be other explanations, not necessarily for the deviation, but for the population risk rate. You know, perhaps there are practices that people have identified.
You would expect there that there should be some correlation between the black versus white and the population risk ratio. The problem is the deviation between the population risk ratio and the black risk ratio.
Yes, is extreme. It is of the same order of magnitude as the population deviation, that 1.4 that we identified. All right. Again, I think, there's a lot of information in the table. The conclusion that we would want to draw from this is that where that deviation has occurred, it is not located within a single discipline or a small group of disciplines. That this the phenomenon we're looking at is widespread. It's not as if, for example, it was only GPs which had this differential rate and everything else was fine, and the GPs were responsible for the population deviation. So we've really had,
Yeah, except for the fact that it seems that specialists are out of the picture.
yes.
Independent specialists.
Yes.
Yeah, and
So
that's
it's
a
not-
large there are a number of subspecialties which
Yes.
sit in there.
So we're not saying that it happens in every discipline, but you're saying that it is widespread enough that that you can dismiss the idea that that population effect is simply due to one subgroup or subset of disciplines that result in the population deviation. Right? That it happens across a wide set of disciplines. Okay, this is slightly more contentious then. We can do exactly the same sort of analysis, but restrict the analysis to each of the parties that contributed data. And I know I've asked for guidance, and you've indicated that there's information in this case that cannot be shared generally, that is potentially still confidential. But the same principle applies. The population that we're looking at for each of the administrators is the total set of providers that were paid during that period, 2012 to 2019. And the FWA cases are the total number of unique cases identified during that period. So if a provider identified if a provider appears more than once in this period, we'll count it as a single case. Right? So we're not going to double count a provider because they've occurred in multiple years. It'll count as a single case. So we're looking at a set of providers and a subset who've been identified as FWA cases. Okay. So those are the risk ratios. So what I've removed from there is all of the numbers that allow you to calculate the individual risk rates. Okay? So and all we have...
Just to be clear, so it's a middle column in the first block.
Yes,
Once
the number of
FWA.
FWA cases over the period, that's removed. I'm removing, so it leaves you at a slight disadvantage. Well, not you, because you can see the table, but from the audience perspective, because you don't know what the population risk rate is. And by the sort of guidance that I've laid out, you should look at 3 numbers to make the judgment. Population risk rate, risk ratio, p-value. But here we can assume that we know that the risk rates are meaningful, and that the risk ratios then across the 3 providers in each case is sufficiently high to indicate that it's meaningful and sufficiently unlikely to say that we can eliminate chance as an explanation. There is an effect across all of the providers, okay? Although the scale of that effect differs according to each of those providers. And that ranges from 1.35 for Discovery Health up to 3.31, okay, with those p-values. I think that's the smallest p-value I've seen in this particular set of analysis.
Sorry, which is?
E to the minus 205. Yeah, that's that's cut someone in half in a magic show.
That's outside of jigsaw puzzle territory.
Yes, yeah, that's, you know, it's a little bit of overkill at this point because unlike, you know, we're talking about events that are just unlikely. If it's e to the 100 or e to the minus 200, we're splitting hairs. It's simply not possible. Okay.
Well, I mean, I suppose it does add into the full picture because what we now know from your exercise is that we know per discipline that the pattern of racial bias is exhibited. We also know that each and every year that pattern is repeated. But we now know also that across the schemes that you looked at, those patterns are replicated.
Yes. And that would be that table. Okay, so that's by provider, by year. Again, the information that would allow you to do the calculation on you can't reconstruct that 2x2 table using this information. Right? So it's just the statistics attached to the table that pop out, with the exception of the population risk.
What is the reason why the risk ratio of med scheme only starts in 2016?
The numbers are too small to make for meaningful calculations.
Numbers prior to 2016?
Yes. That's a combination of incomplete data. The explanation that was provided was that the data could not be reconstructed for that period. So they had information on some FWA cases, but certainly not all. And so I've removed that because the p-values and the risk ratios would be misleading in that case.
Does that explain the 2017 1.82 in the earlier table? Is it because the data from med scheme, I mean, or was it not, do these two not work together at all?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So the 2017 1.82
Which
risk ratio on slide 39, where the risk ratio went up to almost 2 in
Yes.
2017.
Yes, you could infer that, yes, that med scheme played a greater role in driving up that population risk ratio because their risk ratios are above what was observed for the population in those years.
And I wonder, if you look at the discovery table, what you see in 2012, I mean, I suppose the complaint there is 1.09, that's the risk ratio. 2013, 1.12. Okay, 2014 is now on the questionable levels, and so is 2015 and 2016. 2017 seems to be out of kilter, but 2018 then goes back, but 2019 you said we can exclude that. So although earlier I suggest that across the schemes these facts are replicated over the years, it does appear that the real problem is between the years 2014 to 2018. Suppose that's still a long period, that's 5 years.
Yeah. Just to correct that, the risk ratio over the 29 period is still meaningful, right? Because it's independent of time. The risk rates would have to be adjusted, but that risk ratio is still a real measure. So the fact that it's 0.9 in 2019 with a p-value of 0.07 means the effect that was visible in earlier years had dissipated in the 2019 data. There is no racial bias evident in that 29 data as it stands.
And in general, the risk ratio on the part of discovery is much lower than the others.
Yes. Significantly lower.
And again, if you look at the 29 p-value and risk ratio for MedScheme for 2019, it hasn't got any lower.
No. So,
In fact, the MedScheme risk ratio has gone up from 2018. And it stayed the same for GEMS.
yes.
It might show that your earlier speculation that this inquiry has had an impact actually is neutral.
I'm not sure I understand.
When you earlier speculated that the reasons we are seeing lower rates of black FWA being targeted is perhaps the existence of this inquiry. That this inquiry, in fact, has had a neutral effect on what the schemes are doing.
Yes. You say that the effect may be uneven.
Yeah, I mean, you can say for discovery, it's obvious that it's been a positive effect, but for the other two, it's been neutral.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there may be explanations linked to the precise way in which the systems are implemented that'd be worth talking about. Yeah. I don't know if there's much else to say about this particular table. Okay. So what does appear to have disappeared for some reason is the table by provider and administrator, by administrator and discipline. But that I think is perhaps a little bit too detailed in any case for easy consumption. Okay. So just to recap on the issues that were raised, there's no evidence of explicit racial profiling in the design or implementation of systems used to identify potential FWA cases by those three parties.
Dr. Kimi, on that table of administrator and discipline, was there nothing that you wanted was there nothing you wanted to highlight in relation to that table?
I would say a general comment is that it does reveal the very specific implementation of FWA systems across the various disciplines. And to give a general example, if whatever system people were implementing was modular, in the sense that you could apply that fraud identification system as an analysis tool only to specific disciplines, then it would demonstrate that the chances of identifying those disciplines would be higher because you'd have an additional tool. So for example, if administrator
Can you just
A,
start by explaining what we mean by modular?
okay, so if administrator A was implementing a fraud detection system and decided that they would either buy or build the GP module first, and then they would do a pharmacist model, and then they would move on to the others as they became, as the cost justified the additional investment in modules. And that would mean that if all you had, for example, was a module that looked at GPs and pharmacists, that you would target GPs and pharmacists because that's what your data would be guiding you towards. That if you had no module looking at dentists or optometrists, then you would have no information about those areas. And in fact, it is the case that each of the parties has implemented different parts of their fraud detection system at different times. None of the three has a complete solution dropped in. They've all been built over time. And some of the patterns reflected in the way the particular parties have focused their efforts on particular disciplines reflect that set of choices.
Well, we've got a copy of this table. It's table 5.6. Do you want to put it up and talk through it so that, because you say it's disappeared?
I'm not sure why it was on. All I have is the version that we can't share.
No, this version seems to be fine.
No.
All right. Well, so which one do you want to deal with? So, I mean, do you have the version that you had prepared for your PowerPoint?
No, it seems to have. It would take me a bit of time to find it and put it back.
Reconstruct it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, if you've got this, you can look at this and then tell us what conclusions we should draw from this.
Okay.
I would like you to do that as well, because there are some very interesting conclusions, I think, to be drawn in relation to which disciplines, risk ratio in relation to discipline.
Okay. So, I mean.
And each administrator's role in that discipline.
Yes. Okay. So, I'm going to read off some of these figures just for interest's sake. So, within GPs, the general practitioner, which is the largest group, the risk ratio is above 1.4 for all three of the parties, Discovery, GEMS, and MedScheme, but it's significantly higher for GEMS and MedScheme. So it's 1.37 for Discovery, but rising up to 2.2 for GEMS and then 2.3 for MedScheme. So the deviation is more extreme in GEMS and MedScheme for GPs, but all three exhibit extreme deviation. I think interesting observation with pharmacies. Again, we mentioned the classification problem, and that at the population level, it would appear that white, not black pharmacies are being targeted at a higher rate than black pharmacies. That pattern is in fact reversed for MedScheme. And even with that restricted classification, MedScheme, black pharmacies in MedScheme have a 3 times higher rate, risk of being identified as FWA than non-black pharmacies within MedScheme. And that, yes?
Go ahead, I'm waiting to hear what you have to say about physiotherapists.
Amongst optometrists is again, and this is an indication, if you will, of priorities and investment. GEMS has, again, a risk ratio of 2 for optometrists, and for both other providers, the risk ratio is, to all intents and purposes, 1. Okay? The actual risk ratio for GEMS is 4, but the p-value makes it the actual count meaningless. Okay? So
who are you talking about? Because GEMS is 1.98, and then MedScheme is 2.5.
yes, sorry, yeah. So MedScheme for optometrists has a very high risk rate, but it's meaningless, should be ignored. GEMS has a risk ratio of 2, which is meaningful, and that's a differential rate at which black optometrists are being targeted. And again, for Discovery, we can ignore the risk ratio. It's to all intents and purposes, 1. Physiotherapist is an extreme example. Again, as I said, physiotherapists consist of, I think, the 3rd largest group of practitioners after GPs and psychologists. The risk ratio for discovery is 2, so that's quite severe. For GEMS, it's 6. For MedScheme, it's 13. That is a very serious deviation. Dentists, again, is a case where GEMS is the only one with a risk ratio that's meaningful of 2. It's pretty much 1 for discovery and MedScheme. Independent specialists, discovery is again 1, so it's flat. And the deviation occurs with GEMS and MedScheme, with both have risk ratios of about 2. Psychologists, we mentioned before, the 2nd largest category. The risk ratios are all of the same ballpark. For discovery and GEMS at about 4, and MedScheme 6. So remember what risk ratios of 4 and 6 mean. 400 times more likely, 400% more likely, 600% more likely to be targeted. We're talking about differences of 6 for non-black compared to 25 for black.
Physiotherapists, does it mean that they are 1,200% more likely to be targeted by MedScheme?
Yes, the 12. Yes.
I want to know what the 12 means. It's 1,200.
Yes, 12 times. Anesthetist is which number? 12 times more likely. Yes. I think that's the best way to read it. Anesthetist is there's nothing happening. The obstetrics, there is an effect, a very small effect amongst discovery, 1.3, 1.4, but potentially we can ignore that. Amongst GEMS, it's 4, a risk ratio of 4. And MedScheme we can ignore because it's not a meaningful measure. I think those last 3 are again cases where we saw the population risk ratio being extreme. Among social workers, it was somewhere around 7%. I mean, 7 times a risk ratio of 7, and that's replicated in the data. All 3, across all 3 providers.
It's not 7%, it's 700%.
Yes, the risk ratio is 7. And that pattern happens, there's something, I would say, there's something material happening with social workers. Registered counselors, again, they're a slightly smaller group. They're only about, I would say, 600, between 600 and 690 registered counselors. The risk ratio for discovery is 12, so one extremely high.
No, it's 5.
Sorry, I'm reading the wrong column. 5, and with GEMS it's 2, and with MedScheme 3. GEMS again you can ignore. So it's registered counselors, discovery, and MedScheme. And then dietitian, quite a marked deviation in all 3 groups. Discovery 5, GEMS 4, MedScheme 10. All very high rates with very low probabilities.
You prepare the slide
Yes.
so that it's included as
Yes.
part of the slides.
Okay. So I think there is a lot more data to analyze, but I think this is sufficient to believe the case that there is clear and strong evidence of a racial bias with respect to outcomes of FWA processes. I think that is not really in any doubt. I believe that that result will hold up irrespective of the marginal changes that may be made to the way the algorithm is implemented, my analysis is implemented. But that will be available for people to inspect in detail. I indicate the bias is not restricted to a limited time period, nor is it located within only particular disciplines. It may vary in scale across these factors, but it's a pervasive, widespread effect. It's not a bad apple or a bad set of disciplines or a bad year. This is more than an outlier effect in a limited time period or a limited set of disciplines that have given rise to that global effect. This is something that's pretty widespread. And I'm convinced, because I've carefully examined the assumptions that underpin these findings, and I'm convinced that these findings are sufficiently robust, particularly given the cautious way in which we've proceeded with the classification, that they're sufficiently robust, that they're indicative of a real phenomenon that needs explanation, and that any reasonable classification scheme will give rise to similar results. What would be an unreasonable classification scheme? I did one. I used the fact that whether the last digit in the PCNS number was odd or even, and I classified people, the providers, into groups called red and blue, based on whether the last number in the code was odd or even. That, you would say, is blind to any demographic. And as you'd expect, when you do the analysis, there is nothing to be found. The p-values are close to 1. The risk ratios are close to 1. Any random assignment of race, so if race were not a factor, if we randomly assign people to black and not black, you could run that assignment 20, 30, 100,000 times. You would not get close to the data we've seen here. So again, it's another way of saying this is not an artifact of our classification. This is a phenomenon that's real and needs to be explained. Oh, and of course, the first point I would repeat. There is no evidence that this is implemented as part of the fraud identification systems. It may be the case that the factors that are used are linked to race, that they tend to identify black providers more often than not black providers, but that would need further investigation to identify where exactly that mechanism has occurred. So when I say there's no explicit racial profiling, I'm not ruling out that the actual factors the analytics use may contribute to a racially biased outcome, but that in the absence of information about race, the parties involved at this stage are unable to consider the question of whether there's a racial bias.
On that point, there's only one entity that's made their algorithm available, as I understand it. The other two, we don't have insight into those algorithms. Is that right?
Yeah, there's one set of algorithms that is detailed enough that given a racial classification, you can start asking the question about whether the algorithm itself will produce racially biased outcomes. But the other cases are black boxes. So there's there's one black box and there's one gray box, which has a combination of built and inbuilt factors. But even in that case, the precise mechanics of how the result is calculated is proprietary to the service provider. and we have, would not be able to ask or understand how that happened.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. It remains of me then to thank you on behalf of the panel for a thorough job that you have performed and making our job a lot more easier, I hope so, than it otherwise would have been. Obviously, you still remain available to the panel for questions to be asked and further inquiries to be conducted. Now, the future of this inquiry is that we have now completed the public hearings in relation to the complaints that were made against the schemes. We've also completed the evidence of experts. The next big phase will be to hear from the schemes. We had suggested preliminary dates, but those dates, for various reasons, couldn't be met. We will be communicating further dates to all the representatives of the schemes. And just to emphasize the point we made at the beginning, we are anxious that the matter should be finalized as soon as reasonably practical, but we appreciate that people have rights to a fair hearing. They would like to engage with the data that we have, and today's evidence is heard by many people for the first time, and they want to engage with that as well. But despite all of those shortcomings, we would appreciate the people making themselves available on dates that will be communicated by the Secretariat. We are adjourned until further notice.